Good morning and welcome everybody to this, the June 27th, Glancing Back and Looking Ahead, Part 2 webinar. I'm Tom Foley. I'm the SVP of Business Intelligence at Inntopia. I'm going to be joined today by the folks you see on the screen here, Jan Freitag, Comeau, and Barb Taylor-Carpender. We're going to do some introductions in just a moment as well. The intent of this webinar is to take a look at the first half of 2023, a little quick assessment, a little bit of data, and a look at what each of us thinks might be coming up for the balance of 2023 and even into 2024. This is a town hall type meeting, so we're going to be having conversations as we go through. We've got questions to ask and answer. We ask you to put your own questions in as well. You can use that Trello board that was included with your meeting invitation link to put a question in or vote on them. Or you can go to the GoToWebinar portal where there is a questions pane and put it in there, and Stacy Mullen, who's administrating behind the scenes for us, thankfully today, will be able to keep track of those and bring them up and ask the panel as we go forward. So let's go ahead and move on, get into the introductions. I want to start by introducing Barb Taylor-Carpender, a longtime friend, industry expert, and our moderator today. And Barb, if you would just do a little introduction and then tee up Pete and Jan, and we'll get underway.
Well, the condensed version, Tom. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. And for those that are going to listen to the webinar post, welcome to you also. I'm Barb Taylor-Carpender, better known as BT, and my company is Tailored Alliances. I'm a longtime member of the hospitality, meeting, and resort industries, and most recently, in the past 20 years, have been very involved in managing and facilitating customer advisory boards, strategic focus groups, and moderating of webinars, panels, etc. And I'm also a member of Insights Collective, which is a group of resort hospitality and meeting industry professionals, and we're a think tank, or at least we call ourselves a think tank. So it's been great fun being involved in that group and doing some deep dives on the issues that are impacting our industry. And I will now turn it over to Tom to introduce.
Thanks, Barb, very much. Appreciate it. Tom Foley, SVP of Business Intelligence at Inntopia. Most of you on this call attend our regular webinars, and so you are familiar with me. I won't spend any more time introducing myself, but let's ask Jan Freitag to say a word or two. Jan, over to you.
Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Thanks so much for having me participate in this webinar. We have a couple of things to talk about, what happened, and then hopefully we have a lot of time to talk about what we think will happen. I met Barb when she was facilitating a customer advisory board, not quite 20 years ago, but quite a while ago. So good to see you again, and thanks for having me, and I'll turn it over to Pete.
Hello, everyone. Pete Comeau here, Managing Director of Focusrite. I've been at Focusrite for 15 years. Prior to that, I worked for a ski wholesale company called Moguls Travel, which is kind of where I cut my teeth in the mountain tourism industry. So my passion is with resort travel. Focusrite as a business is a global market research firm focused on what we call the intersection of travel and technology. Although it seems lately that we're at the intersection of travel and ChatGPT, which is, of course, the biggest technology topic of the day. We produce events, we produce research, we also cover the daily happenings of travel technology through our website, FocusWire, our media site. So we are in the throes of travel technology. We also look at distribution trends across all different segments, and we look at it on a global basis. So as we were framing the discussion for today, we thought we would start with some kind of macro data so we can really look at what's going on in the broader market. And then we can kind of gradually drill down as I hand it back to Jan, and Jan will hand it to Tom, and we'll get into the we'll get into the specifics of resort tourism trends. So Tom, if you want to tee up the first slide here. So I wanted to start with looking at the broader U.S. Hotel and lodging market, and clearly it didn't just recover in 2022, it prospered. And that prosperous nature came from unleashed pent-up demand that lifted ADRs and occupancy, which Jan will touch on in a little bit, to a record-breaking year as room revenue swept past pre-pandemic highs. But the industry's return to profitability was not without a little bit of a struggle. The labor shortage, a recent crisis that was exacerbated by COVID, impeded hotels' ability to fully operate. And many of you that traveled during the COVID time experienced restaurants not being open, challenges with hotels servicing large groups, or even daily room service was something that was kind of cut during that time, and for some properties hasn't been fully introduced back yet. So the result was a continued rise in rate to satisfy that pent-up demand, even though some properties couldn't keep up with the service level. And hotel sector now represents 45% of all U.S. travel gross bookings, which is a larger percentage than it's represented in quite some time. Hotels still face many challenges, including the ongoing talent shortage, as I alluded to earlier, and the slow return of large business travel, so business groups and meetings, although we're starting to see that come back in earnest this summer and into the fall. And that's the bread and butter for many urban properties. However, leisure travelers, especially those taking drive vacations or traveling domestically, and trends in remote work continue to fuel the growth. Digital nomads who can work from anywhere and business travelers seeking longer stays as they combine business and pleasure into one trip are poised to boost hotel performance into 2023 and beyond. So US hotel room revenue neared $190 billion in 2022, which was up a dramatic 33% from 2021 and 122% above a dismal 2020. Although the recovery slowed to half the rate in 2021, hotels exceeded 2019 revenue ahead of what we originally scheduled. Hotels' remarkable comeback in 2021, 2022 is even more impressive considering the rising competition from short-term rentals. Travelers chose rentals for unique experiences, longer-term stays, value, or extra room and amenities for larger groups, clearly the bread and butter of short-term rentals. The pandemic accelerated gains in home and apartment rentals, and according to Focusrite research in 2020, 43% of rental users who most recently stayed in a rental were first-time users compared to 35% in 2019. So the competition with hotels is real, as 45% of those travelers also considered a hotel the last time they booked a rental, indicating that this traveler is a potentially lost customer for hotels. Driven mainly by Airbnb and Vrbo, the US short-term rental market climbed 26% to reach $53.5 billion in 2022. Led by North America and Europe, Airbnb reported global gross booking value of $63.2 billion for 2022, a whopping 35% increase from 2021. Meanwhile, Booking.com has cited 30% of global room nights. Has cited that alternative accommodation room nights grew 56% in 2022 versus 2021, and that represented 30% of global room nights. Focusrite projects the US short-term rental market will near $68 billion in 2026 and represent close to 1/4 of the US hospitality marketplace. As far as growth rates go for US short-term rentals, they'll average 10% or so for the next 2 years, and then we'll start to slow to mid-single digits by 2026. On the other hand, hotel growth rates will be a couple of percentage points less for 2023 and 2024 before converging with short-term rental growth rates by 2025, 2026. So Tom, if you want to flip to the next slide, ChatGPT and generative AI has been a huge technology topic this year, and it appears to be one of those big platform shifts similar to the internet in the 1990s, mobile in the mid-2000s, social media in the 2010s. And while it's still early, there are new developments almost on a weekly basis, and this tells us that this is not just a fleeting trend. As the industry grapples with how to best leverage artificial intelligence, travelers are also starting to adopt it. As we prepared for Focusrite Europe in mid-June in Barcelona, we fielded a survey to European travelers to try to understand, how interested they are in using GPT and generative AI to help plan their travel. And without, as we see in the rest of our consumer research, there's always a variance by country, and this is the same in this case regarding how comfortable they feel using GPT and generative AI to help plan their trips. Places like France and Germany are more hesitant around the technology, where other markets like the UK, Italy, and Spain have almost half of travelers feeling good about tapping into artificial intelligence for advice and ideas. But regardless of how comfortable they feel starting out, one thing holds true: the more conveniences generative AI can offer, the more comfortable travelers will become with the idea of using it for their travels. The people who are most open to using ChatGPT in their trip planning have different needs from the process than your general traveler. They need to save time and energy on their research processes, so help from new and interesting tech is more welcomed. We see this with travelers who took 3 or more leisure trips in the year, those going outside Europe to places that feel more foreign and can require more research, longer trips of a week or more, and also last-minute bookers who are short on time to plan their trip. This tool may not be for everyone, but with so many pain points still lingering in trip planning and inspiration, the travelers who need the most assistance may turn to new tools to fill in some of the gaps in their processes. So again, as we think about new technology and platform shifts, ChatGPT, while we're still early in the release of that technology, it's certainly going to be a game changer, and things like personalization that we've talked about for over a decade now, and providing kind of seamless travel, I think we're going to get closer to that with this type of technology, and we can get into some of that during the discussion. So without further ado, I'm going to flip it over to Jan, who's going to get into some trends around ADR and occupancy.
Thank you so much. So what I want to share with you is our 2 slides. We're looking forward first. This is the forecast as presented by STR's President Amanda Hite at the NYU Hotel Investment Conference 2 weeks ago. As some of you know, CoStar bought STR right before the pandemic in late 2019. CoStar is a clearinghouse for commercial real estate data. So we own apartments.com, so we have very deep insights into what's the average lease for a 2-bedroom apartment in Des Moines. We own LoopNet, so we have very deep insights into how much does a mall lease for, a mall space lease for. We have very, very deep insights into who buys office space and leases for offices. And now CoStar has access to this hotel data. I was with STR for 20 years and have since 2020 been the national director on the CoStar side for the hospitality piece. So my role hasn't really changed. I still talk about the data a lot. And part of what we talk about is that the forecast is slowing. So what you see here is the year-end 2022 results are, of course, rebound numbers. We don't expect those numbers to happen again. If those numbers happen, if you see RevPAR growth of 30%, that means something terrible happened the year before. So we don't want that to ever happen again. And we're now getting into more normal numbers. So the RevPAR forecast for this year is 5%. This is driven by an interplay of supply and demand. And honestly, there's not a whole lot happening on the supply side. The lack of clarity on debt financing makes it very, very hard to make a project pencil. And after the Silicon Valley meltdown, a lot of small and regional banks are shoring up their balance sheets. So they're sort of tapped out on lending, specifically on lending in hotels, because of course, for an office or a logistics center, you can pre-lease it. A hotel, you can't pre-lease. So we're inherently more risky. So you see limited new supply growth, healthy demand growth that gets you some occupancy gains, and then the room rate growth is around 3.5%. That sounds okay, but obviously the forecast for CPI growth this year is roughly around 3.5% as well. So there's no real growth. So everything that you drive on the top line is eaten up with expense growth. The other thing to mention here is that that 5% number, if it comes to pass, and if we are indeed in a recession, which is the CoStar house call for the latter part of this year, that would be unprecedented. We have not in our 30-year history seen a recession with positive RevPAR growth. We've always seen demand deceleration and ADR deceleration in a recession. Is this time different? Question marks. Economists hate to say things are different, but maybe this time it is indeed different, and we can talk about if there's going to be a recession. That's the house call for CoStar anyways. And then you see for 2024, not a whole lot changes. We're expecting that CPI is going to slow, so we're seeing ADR growth just at that level. Again, no real rate growth, and healthy room demand growth, which will then mean that we're selling more rooms than ever before. So that's what we're going to think is going to happen. On the next slide, we're looking at what did happen. So this is the year-over-year percent change in room rates. And a couple of stories here, storylines that pop out. So number one, what we're looking at here are the branded properties broken out between luxury and economy, and then this independent sort of catch-all, which captures 1-star to 5-star properties. But let's focus on the luxury, so let's focus on the chains. Just we assume that the independents that slot in the same ADR range sort of work the same way. You're seeing here that the luxury room rates are now negative, have decelerated for 4 months in a row. Why is that? We can talk about this in the Q&A a little bit later, but part of it is probably that, wow, they are still 25% above where they were in 2019. So while there is year-over-year deceleration compared to 19, they're still quote unquote off the charts. Who else is doing quite well? Upper upscale chains and upscale chains are now finally seeing a small acceleration in demand, and with that comes some pricing power, especially as we see the corporate transient traveler coming back. So in this instance, softening on the room rate side may not necessarily be a bad thing, because it implies that the total transient leisure traveler that was basically our bread and butter in 2021, 2022 is now being partially substituted by corporate transient travel. And those people traditionally don't pay bar, they pay a little bit slightly lower rate. And so the mix is shifting. And so if we see lower rate growth, that could be a good thing, because it could imply that we're seeing corporate transient coming back. And then on the lower and mid-scale chains and economy chains, those have just roared back out of the gate in 2021 and 2020. And so we're now seeing very much a normalization in room rate growth. So looking ahead, it's very hard to make up an argument that luxury rates are going to continue to grow 10%. That's probably not going to happen. Are they going to grow? That is really, your mileage may vary. There's a lot more activity, and Pete talked about a little bit, in downtown areas. So corporate transit demand drives downtown urban hotel occupancy. And we'll talk a lot more about that in our town hall. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Tom.
Thank you, Jan. Appreciate it. Interesting stuff. And it's going to be fun to talk about the difference between what you're seeing in this data and what we're seeing in the mountains. We're going to talk about that now. I, not surprisingly, have the busiest slides because I can't help myself. And so let's take a look at 2023 so far, looking at destination travel and concentrating on mountain communities. But a lot of this is also applicable to non-mountain destination resorts at beach communities and so forth. A lot of that transfers back and forth. And really, so far, 2023 has all been about price sensitivity. We heard Jan talking about what was going on with the luxury chain and rates coming down, and how high they were versus pre-pandemic. We're seeing much the same thing take place in mountain communities. Here on the top left-hand side of this page, we're looking at year-over-year, concentrating on summer ADR, occupancy, and RevPAR, looking forward as of February 28th to summer bookings, which were coming in May 1st to October 31st, and then taking that same snapshot over the ensuing 30 days. And heading into summer bookings this year, Room rate was up 7.9% as of February 28th for those summer arrivals, but occupancy was down a really strong 14.2% on the books, and RevPAR was down 7.4%. If we were to look at this in terms of demand, in other words, room nights booked, that number was closer to 18% here, and revenue down about 9.5%. And so there's obviously some pushback going on. One of the reasons is, again, that rate growth that Jan was just talking about in the hotel sector, we've seen very much in the mountain sector, except rather than 20-odd% higher, we're actually about 42% higher than 2019. And so there is some market force pushing rates back down, so that now, as of 31st of May, summer rates are actually just barely above flat, up 0.9% across the industry. That has helped drive demand, and occupancy is still down year over year, 5%, but dramatically better than it was 90 days ago. And RevPAR is down 4.1%. It's really notable because we haven't seen any sustained season-wide drops in either occupancy or RevPAR really since the middle of the pandemic in 2020. And prior to that, looking at summer season growth, you have to go back to just coming out of the Great Recession right around 2011. So rate sensitivity is certainly at play. So we dug into it a little bit to see what was going on. And this is where we see some contrary behavior in mountain and destination communities from what Jan is seeing in the hotel communities and largely urban markets. Not all consumers and properties are created equal. Over the course of the last 30 days, we tracked what happened with the softening of year-over-year rate and the gains or losses in year-over-year occupancy during that period. And that's what we're showing over here on the right-hand side chart. And what we did was break the data down by price terciles. So properties with an ADR up to $250, properties with an ADR $251 to $400, and then with an ADR $401 and above. And over the course of the last 30 days, that year-over-year ADR at the most economical properties came down 1 percentage point. And the hope, of course, is that you can drive some business there. But at the same time, year-over-year occupancy actually softened further, 1.5%. At the same time, skipping over to the higher end price products, rate came down just ever so slightly, 0.6% year-over-year over the course of the last 30 days. But occupancy year-over-year gained dramatically, 13.9% on the luxury market with almost no rate movement at all. In the meantime, the consumer in the middle tier is actually responding well to softening rates, where year-over-year rate came down 3% and year-over-year occupancy went up 4.2%. And as we look at this, we wonder about it a little bit. And first of all, the win is likely to come because of the relative low volume of these more expensive bookings. Any win that we're going to get in occupancy or demand is probably going to come from these lower tiers. But the problem that we think we're seeing around the lower priced properties is an inability to really drop rate a whole lot further. Their client needs them to get to an absolute rate that's palatable, and maybe that's $175 a night. The problem is that rates have gone up so much that getting to that requires a really strong drop in year-over-year ADR. But that's difficult to do when your margins have vanished due to rising cost of employment, fringe and benefits, and getting your staff on hand. And so they may not have the room to actually bring down rates enough to satisfy a more economically minded consumer. In the meantime, we've got this middle tier. There is more room for margin. Those properties are dropping rate more. They're dropping rate more than any other properties in this group that we analyzed. And they're getting the strongest response. So that's where the opportunity exists. But part of the problem is still the same. Rates still remain up dramatically from where they were in 2019, where the consumer doesn't care about year over year. They care about an absolute number, and they're looking for that $325 or that $175. So it's been an interesting act. We'll see how it plays out over the course of the summer. Easing inflation is playing a role in helping make things a little bit more palatable. But even when inflation is sitting at 4%, that's compounded on top of last year's 8.6%. so that over the course of 2 years, things are still 13 or 14% more expensive outside of the travel costs than they were. And so people's pocketbooks are going to be feeling it for quite some time until that inflation rate has steadily gotten down around 2%. So as we look forward then to understand what we think is going to happen for the balance of the year, the two parts here, the top three is sort of some takeaways of what we think. And the first is that an ADR reset is clearly underway. And with the most sensitive consumers, really lower and mid-price properties rate is going to determine how demand goes for the next while. And they're likely to move year over year negative as far as ADR goes, at least in aggregate, in order to draw in some consumers. And that's going to have to probably happen for a little while. The question will be whether or not that can drive enough demand to offset those negative rates and keep RevPAR on the positive side of the spectrum. And there's the balancing act that we all know about. Length of stay is another one, and length of stay has shortened considerably over the course of the last couple of years from where it was right upon reopening. And that's starting to stabilize. And if ADR comes down, length of stay will probably stop shortening and even extend out a little bit more as folks can afford to stay a bit longer as rates come down and when inflation settles. But bargain ADR volume is going to need to offset these compounded LOS declines so that occupancy continues to go up. And room demand is probably going to remain fairly flattish. So room demand is not climbing in huge amounts. It's probably going to go up a little bit, depends upon how far the rate comes down. And so the chart down below sort of has what we had within some cones to look at things in a contextual manner, both historically and looking back. And on this chart we're seeing here is occupancy indexed back to pre-pandemic, or January 2020 actually, with a 12-month average going through, moving average. And we can see that occupancy has really remained pretty flat for much of the last year or so, year and a bit, as far as indexed back to the just pre-pandemic times. We expect that going forward, it's going to reside somewhere within this cone, a little bit up, a little bit down. If we draw the median, that really sits at about flat. In the meantime, if we look at ADR on the green line, we do expect that that is likely going to have to continue to come down as this economic reset takes place. And the combined result of that will be that RevPAR, or revenue, is going to probably also decline somewhat from where it is now, but keeping in mind that we're still dramatically up from where we were on both of these critical revenue numbers just a couple of years ago, thanks in part to those really high rate gains. So that gets us through where we wanted to get through as far as the data content goes. So the goal now is to probably turn on some cameras here, which we had said we were going to do. And hi, everybody. Let's continue on. I want to hand things over to Barb, our moderator, to see, first of all, if she's got anything to add about 2023 so far and what she sees going on in her area of expertise, and otherwise help keep us in line for the next while to guide us through some questions and answers.
I'm going to start on the second, which is try and keep you all in line for a little bit of time. And I'll jump in as the topic is appropriate. One of the questions that came in, and there were many likes on it, was talking about planning for fiscal year 24. And I'm going to start with you, Tom, only because that is most prominent in my mind on some of the information that you were showing. So you're saying that there's definitely a softening in ADR. For all three of you, do you see that continuing through what would be the winter season, which many of our listeners are involved in, and well into 24? What does it look like, especially when it comes to budgeting purposes?
Sure. From our perspective, depending upon what happens over the course of the next 3 months, if ADR pulls back enough to start to drive some demand, I think it's going to stay fairly flat or go up slightly over the course of next year, and perhaps do some growth that's in line with economic growth. That will have us reset well above 2019 if that occurs, but flat-ish or slightly up from this year next is the way we're thinking about it. But there's a caveat to that, and that has a lot to do with what happens over the course of winter, which plays a big part in the first quarter of any fiscal year that starts on January 1st. If we have a strong snow season everywhere, all bets go out the window. We've learned that over time in the ski industry, that doesn't matter what's going on. It could be the Great Recession. If there's good snow, people who are skiers are going to show up, and the rate demand, the ability to demand that rate is there. So it's a little bit up in the air because so much is driven by what happens. I have one caveat to that, though. We did brilliantly on rate through most of this winter season because of strong snow, but consumers pulled back very quickly as soon as the shift to summer happened this year. And so I would expect that summer is going to behave, summer and winter need to be thought about a little bit differently. Summer next year, likely to be what I first said, slightly up from where we are, depending upon where the reset goes to this year. Winter, it's really up to Mother Nature.
And predicting her is always an adventure.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'll jump in, Barb. And Jan, you can probably piggyback on this because I've seen some of your projections about just broader macro conditions, but I think more and more there's anticipation that there'll be some sort of mild recession in Q4 carrying over into Q1. So while travel companies are still seeing quite some demand, and this is, broadly speaking across the market, there is some anticipation, and we heard this at Focusrite Europe, that as we kind of leak over into the fall, the bigger players in the market, the TUIs, the Thomas Cooks, the Bookings and Expedias are anticipating that there'll be a little bit of softening demand just because of the macro conditions. So that's something that we're going to keep our eyes on. It's really been incredible so far how travel has bucked the trend of some other industries that have pulled back a little bit. It may be just a delayed effect into the fall, but to Tom's point, skiers are skiers, and if the snow falls, they will follow. So it's a little bit different with some of the micro industries, but I think broadly speaking, we're anticipating a bit more of a slowdown in the fall and into the spring.
Yeah, we're certainly suggesting growth is just slower growth. A couple of sort of forces play against each other, and we're not quite sure where we're going to end up. So if indeed there's a macroeconomic slowing, it looks like that we still have a lot of open positions, and it's easier for people to find a job. So even if there are layoffs, they're going to be able to find something new. On the other side, you have interest rates that have not stopped rising, and the Federal Reserve is likely going to increase their interest rates. So things are going to get more expensive. Your credit card bill is going to get more expensive. If you have to refinance your home or move, your mortgage payment is going to be much, much more expensive than what it was 5-6 years ago. So you have these forces of, a lot of people have jobs, but everything is getting more expensive. And where does leisure travel fit into that? I agree with you, of course. Skiers are skiers, but on the very high end, maybe skiers are skiers in Italy, right? And Europe is open and the planes are flying again. And if you have that type of money and you were sort of quote unquote cooped up in Colorado for the last 3 years, you're ready to explore something new. So I think all of this put into the mix, stir it up, and I think what you get is exactly what Tom and Peter are saying, which is growth, but much slower growth.
Jan, to your point, I actually like that as well. When you talk about, skiers are skiers, but yes, there's this luxury group that might go do it in Val Gardenia or something like that. And it really, right now, the conditions are right for that. With the US dollar is still really strong versus foreign currency. It entices people to go away. There are some good flight deals available for summer or winter travel. It doesn't really matter. And it actually makes international travel to the United States a little bit harder. So there is this, what is the competition? Well, it's ourselves, but over there, across the sea, as well as difficulty getting Canadians to come across the border. The border traffic by road is still down 30-odd% from where it was. And USTA is telling us that international arrivals from across the water are down, 24% in April still, from 2019 levels. And so those are big numbers.
Yeah, I've seen as high as 30% down still in the international inbound. When we talk about an outlook for a recession, are there markets that are there geographic markets for the traveler that may be impacted more than others. And we're not getting into urban right now. We're talking primarily leisure. Urban has its own set of interesting little anomalies right now that I can talk about a little bit later.
My own sense is that, more affluent destinations, whether they're in the mountains or anywhere else, always fare a little bit better when the economy turns downward because there's more disposable income for that consumer. And that those are at the lower end of the scale suffer a little bit more. We kind of saw some of that in the data that I was showing in those terciles, and the challenges at the economy level of getting people to come even with a reduced rate. So that's my take about what the challenge looks like.
Well, when we were preparing for this yesterday, we were talking about luxury is having a bit of a slowdown. And Jan, you reflected that in the information that you showed. However, it's still being reported that luxury is somewhat leading the way out of the past few years. And your comment was, two things can be true at the same time. So can you give us a little bit of insight on both of those?
Yeah, I'm spending quite a bit of time actually talking to reporters who want to write a story about, oh, wow, look at these room rates. They're crazy high. What's going on? And then I always have to sort of dampen it and say, two things can be true. Yes, compared to 2019, room rates are up, 20 on the luxury side, maybe 25%. But they're actually declining year over year. And keep in mind that everything is getting more expensive, especially on the luxury end. The service that you're expecting, the amenities that you're expecting, they're very expensive to provide. So that does not necessarily mean that the top line falls to the bottom, right? So that the owners may actually not see this windfall that looks like, oh, wow, room rates are up 20% on the top. Profits are certainly not up 20%. So I think that's sort of the conversation on the luxury side. I think specifically there, what Tom mentioned, what we just talked about, people going elsewhere. I think we're seeing that Miami Beach, the Keys, maybe to an extent on the high-end Colorado traveler who are saying, okay, I did the US for 3 years, I'm good. Let me now go venture out. So they're not traveling less, they're just not traveling so that we capture it.
Another question that had come in prior to the webinar, and I'm going to shift a little bit here, is talking about the booking window. And Tom, you actually have some information on that. Is the booking window shrinking? What's it looking like right now? And do you see whatever it is right now extending into this upcoming winter season?
Sure. Yeah, the booking window has behaved all sorts of odd ways over the course of the pandemic, as you would expect. When the pandemic first hit, it extended out to 140 days in mountain communities. It's normally sitting around 40 or 50 days. So that was what we saw. The question that was teed up was that, the booking window is actually shorter now than it was pre-pandemic. Are we expecting that to change? And the data that we've got is actually a little bit contrary to that. And I actually do have a chart here. Looking at booking lead time, so it's the difference between the day on which a booking's made and the date of scheduled date of arrival. And we're looking at 2019 over on the far right-hand side with January, February, March, April, and May bookings all the way through, and a year-to-date of 44 days lead time in 2019. Shift over here, we've actually got a current lead time of 53.5 days. It's only slightly down from where it was last year at this time at 56.2 and 54.2 in 2021. And so it's kind of interesting. We're actually seeing it extended, and it's been extended for all sorts of different reasons. And I think one of the reasons that it's extended right now is there are a lot of early bookings happening for winter and mountain resorts earlier than previously, and some good rates being captured for November, December right now as well. So that's one of them. The other is that earlier on in the year, you can see this extended time in January. And I think a lot of that was really consumers in January looking at the current rate, feeling the economic crunch and saying, I'm gonna start booking for late or mid-summer now. It's less expensive and I wanna get that on the books rather than concentrating on winter travel, which was almost twice as expensive. So I think that's one of the explanations for it. I actually expect lead times to remain pretty much the way they are for a while now. I think consumers are planning a little bit further in ahead than they were pre-pandemic and are locking things in. And I think that's also where some of the opportunities exist for them to lock in the savings before occupancy drives up rate and it gets beyond their control. So that's what I see. I'm interested, though. I think, Pete, you're looking at this sort of thing too.
Yeah, so yes, and as I look at booking windows, I like to use some sources of data with massive massive samples. I'm always, Tom and I are always looking for as big of samples as we can find. And Skyscanner is a generally it's a meta search flight site. They've expanded their presence in North America, more recently. So their data tends to be a little bit more Europe centric, although they certainly have plenty of users in the US. I think they just surpassed 100 million monthly users. So I look at their data, and clearly it's flight data that they have access to. And to back up some of Tom's statements, they're definitely seeing booking windows increase. In the 60 to 89 day range. If they're looking at domestic travel, they're seeing a 14% increase from their Q1 traffic, and then over 90 days, a 26% increase. And I think that speaks to we're still at a reduced capacity situation with the airlines, and we're also at an increased rate situation. So Tom, I'm not sure where you're finding your airfares to Europe, but we just spent an arm and a leg to bring my family over there. And, given it was summer travel, which tends to be relatively expensive. But the airlines are still demanding a premium, and travelers are really starting to look for deals far in advance. And, that's kind of pulling the lead time, at least on the flight side, to the longer booking windows. As things start to normalize, which, we expect will happen over the next 6 to 9 to 12 months or so, there will be increased capacity. I suspect airfare prices will come down a little bit. Maybe the lead times will kind of look a little bit more like they looked back in 2019.
By the way, Pete, I'm notoriously cheap when it comes to my travel. So there's that.
No
But I
comment.
think
Yeah.
one other piece then that is maybe psychological is that if you're indeed booking further ahead, you feel good about the fact you're probably going to have a job, right? So you're not thinking the world is coming to an end as we know it, and you're saying, well, I feel pretty good, 90 days out, 180 days out, let me book that vacation. So that would speak to some sort of that the American leisure consumer anyways is still feeling pretty good about what's coming.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's sort of a version of consumer confidence. I know that the conference board actually looks at, how people are feeling about the current employment situation and future employment prospects. And both of those were kind of wishy-washy last month. And of course, consumer confidence hasn't really gone anywhere in the most, 8 months or so. It's kind of sitting right around 102 and 103. But I like thinking about it in those terms, Jan. Yeah.
I'm going to do what might be a little bit more lengthy tee up on this next one. And the long-standing competition between destination travel and the urban markets. And as the corporate traveler has not come back to the levels that had been existing before, many of the urban markets are really ramping up their efforts for the leisure travelers. And most of the advisory boards that I work with, customer advisory boards, are more urban located, and it's very interesting in how they're approaching it. Whether it's that, okay, Pete, you can cover your ears on this, that leisure market, but trying to add on some leisure stay pre-post to a business trip, or just all out going for the leisure traveler. So what are you all seeing when it comes either to occupancy and or RevPAR as it compares to our resort destinations?
think that's,
The urban
I'd like to
markets
hear
have
what you're seeing, Jan, in the urban centers, and if you think it is competitive to destination travel.
So again, two things can be true, right? The growth rates can be really, really healthy, but we're coming off such a low base that we're nowhere near where we were in 2019 in terms of room demand. And to me, this all hinges on return to office. You tell me how people are coming back and working in the office, and I tell you what's going to happen with upper upscale urban hotels. The problem is nobody knows. You know, Amazon sent out an email and said, we want you back in the office. And what they meant was 3 days. And the Slack channel against it had like 30,000 members or something. You know, like the pitchforks came out. Then you have Farmers Insurance, this new CEO who's like, oh, my old CEO was just kidding. This is the new rule is we all have to go back, versus saying, oh, you can work from anywhere. And Apple is saying, hey, being in the office is now part of your bonus structure, you know, and your annual review. So I think there's a push back to the office, but will we ever see everybody back 5 days? Well, A, that never really happened anyways, but B, I don't really think so. So downtown is going to continue to be challenged if we don't have people back in the office. On the leisure resort side, I think we've seen tremendous growth and tremendous strong levels of demand, and I think those are just easing because of the topics that we already mentioned. One last comment on the downtown areas. I think, and Barb, you can chime in here. It seems that because we're not in the office, but our head of HR still has to build culture. How do we do this if we're not all in the office? Well, let's just have a meeting. Let's just all come to New Orleans or Denver or Nashville or whatever on a Wednesday night, have a nice dinner, you know, Thursday morning training, Thursday afternoon team building, and leave. So I think there are new meetings that didn't exist in 2019 that we're now seeing that are helping us a little bit, you know, with room demand in downtown areas.
And that's absolutely true. Right now, the convention center business has not yet come back to the levels that it had been. However, some of the big box hotels or the self-contained, the meetings, speaking to what you're saying, Jan, are absolutely on the rise. And how does that impact a downtown area and the restaurants and the walkability? It compared to taking that same smaller meeting to a resort destination. So where are the opportunities that might exist for our audience members in attracting that business? Hopefully there's not a lot of urban on right now, but still attracting that business and or going for the pre and post, you know, talking again to that leisure standing, but people want to meet face to face. That is just not going away. And how it's being addressed internally and sometimes driven a little bit by the HR departments on building the culture is absolutely at the forefront of many of the conversations when it comes to urban areas. So we are in the last few minutes, and I would like to throw out a couple of questions to all of you that will help in planning and for the year ahead. One is, what are some disruptors that you see either happening right now that could get larger or are on the horizon that we should keep our eyes open for?
I'll jump in first with that one. I still think we're challenged with service levels, and that's across the industry, whether you're talking hotels or talking airlines. The ability for airlines to handle disruptions is still not fully there. One of our colleagues, our editor-in-chief of FocusWire, was flying back from our European event in Barcelona, and she was delayed in Philly because of storms, and the only way for her to get to Orlando was to connect through Dallas and spend the entire day traveling yesterday to get back to Orlando. And sure, that's a one-off story, but it's the challenge with full planes and fewer of them is relocating people when there's any disruption. And certainly Jan knows the hotel space very well, but the hotels as well are challenged with service levels, and I think that's something that we're still going to have to fight through. The demand and there's still strong demand for travel. People are willing to put up with it to some degree. Business travelers, maybe not so much. And business travelers are the segment that really has held back the recovery to some degree. A percentage of business trips dropped out, and maybe we'll see that come back. Jan made a great point about return to office, and Barb, you as well, about the culture of the office space is really critical with remote work, and it'll be interesting to see how all those factors kind of play out here in the near term.
Mm-hmm. Tom or Jan, disruptors that will be impacting us?
Well, Pete touched on it on one of his slides, and I think it's a potentially positive disruptor, and that is, the emergence of AI and how it's going to impact travel. It's going to, I think, mitigate some of those service level issues, at least on the communication front. And it's probably going to be able to, and actually Pete's data are proving out that it's actually successfully driving business and getting engagement. I believe that the opportunities that exist there are only just showing up. And I know, Pete, your data was about ChatGPT specifically, but if you dive into the pool of what's out there and go beyond, Bard and ChatGPT and look at the products that are out there, there's a lot of very, very clever stuff going on. And probably my footnote to that is it's not as new as everybody says. You guys were talking about it in 2012. I know that Travelocity was talking about it in 2004. It's just a matter of now the technology is caught up with the ideas. And so I think that's a disruptor that we're going to watch for a while, and it is sort of a watershed inflection moment for all industries, but certainly travel. And I think it's a positive opportunity and disruptor.
Yeah, on the hotel side specifically, the disruptor is just that money is so damn expensive. And it used to cost nothing, and there were no bad ideas. And now you really, really, really have to bet your ideas. Supply growth in May for the US was 0.2%. So we've always overbuilt. We've always been our own worst enemy. Not this time around. So if you can put capital to work and actually build ballrooms and build meeting facilities in your property, you're going to sit very, very pretty for a long time to come, because Barb and I are pretty bullish on group, and you have so little competition. It's very, very hard to get stuff done. So that's a quote unquote disruptor that we haven't traditionally seen. The long run growth rate for supply in the US is 2.1%. We're at 0.2.
Wow.
Yeah.
Good one.
So now let's look on the other side of that, which is untapped or under realized opportunities as we look forward. Pete, Tom, you just brought up ChatGPT. Pete, you talked about it. And one of the things you said, Pete, is that it is attractive to the last minute bookers. How might we be taking advantage of that in our resort communities or lodging communities, of this last minute booker that is using AI?
Yeah. No, it's great. I mean, it's the best use cases are when you're time constrained, and and that goes for frequent travelers that are taking many trips and they don't have a significant amount of time to research all options, and the last minute traveler. So it is, and it'll be really interesting to see how this plays out, because as Tom noted, we're still early days in the rollout of this technology, and we talk a lot about ChatGPT and Bard, but just the concept of AI has been around for quite some time. Google branded themselves as an AI first company, I think back 6-7 years ago. So it's not that AI is new to the scenes, it's just using large language modules to really allow you to tap into lots of different data sources and personalized results. And I think for last minute travel, It's about, really making sure that, that your information is up to date, that you've got your availability up to date, those types of things. I mean, that's table stakes anyway, but the companies that are really able to keep those things up to date, they're the ones that are going to be able to kind of take advantage of it the most.
Okay.
I totally agree. That's worth stressing, because these language models, they're not intelligent, right? They just grab what's out there. You got to make sure that how you're represented is exactly the way you want to be represented, so that when the last minute booker says, whatever, Aspen next weekend with kids and 2 dogs, that you come up, if that's indeed who you are, because the information that you provided out there to the internet is indeed that. So Pete, totally agree with that.
Yeah, and just one more note there. Make sure you're using these tools as you're developing your content on your website, because it'll make you so much more efficient. You can write amazing marketing language by using these tools that are freely available. So use them, try them out, because this is here to stay. It's not just gonna drift away. So don't be scared of it. Embrace it.
And you mentioned using language models and stuff, and one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot is tapping into new markets using translation technology, where you can actually write language that is dialectically correct, and the system will go ahead and do that for you. You can tap into markets that you've never been able to communicate with. There are ways to code your system to accept foreign characters that these systems can do, and they do it accurately. And I think that's an opportunity that exists, is the ability to communicate with a crowd that you've heretofore been unable to communicate with.
And rest assured that our clients are using that artificial intelligence, and I'm speaking specifically about the group market and meetings and conventions. And I attended a couple of sessions last week at Meeting Professionals International, talking to the meeting professionals on how can you utilize this, because they are still extremely understaffed. And anything that they can get off their plate, they're getting it off their plate. So, pay attention to something that may be coming into your group departments that you really have to scrutinize and make sure, who actually wrote this, and is this really what they're looking for?
Yeah.
Just to kind of get that little edge up. So we have 2 minutes left. Key takeaways. If you were in our audience, what would you walk away with from today?
Well, I think the biggest one that I would walk away with is probably just rate volatility. We're seeing it in the market that Jan's looking at. We're seeing in the market that we're looking at. Consumers are price sensitive. They're going to be price sensitive for a while. Their savings that they built up over the course of the pandemic are mostly gone. The pent up demand is gone, and now it comes down to whether or not they can afford to finance a trip on a credit card. And so I think we need to be really mindful of the fact that we've done very well in the last couple of years, and in order to keep that going, we're probably going to have to do some version of a rollback sacrifice.
Okay.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
think the conversation around value, like, yes, prices are up, but what am I getting for that? I feel that's still a good conversation to have. What are you providing to your customers? What can you advertise? Like, going back to the ChatGPT conversation, what can you advertise? How can they find you? And yes, rates are up, but everything is up. Yet your costs are going up. What do you provide to the customer so that they can say, okay, that still makes sense for me in that budget?
Yeah, and I would just say that take advantage of being in the travel industry at the moment, because we are truly bucking the trends. Sure, there's challenges on a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month basis, but it is amazing how well travel has stood up. As a discretionary spend category, this is something that we track every year, and travel remains super strong compared to some of the other categories. And it seems like as people are making decisions about where to spend their money, at least as of now, they're prioritizing travel over consumable goods and other things. And we've talked about experiences as something that really came out of the pandemic, as something that is just critical to people's well-being. And what a better place to offer experiences than in the travel industry. So
yeah, we are at the top of the hour. Barb, thank you for guiding the conversation. Jan and Pete, thank you for joining. As always, thank you to our audience for joining. Remind you that you will receive a post-event survey. We ask you to take that. It's important to help us understand what you're looking for and to make sure we're meeting your needs. But I would like to thank everybody and bid you a fair day.
Thank you.
Thanks again,
Thanks.
Tom.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Jan, Tom, and Pete.